You call this framework offensive realism. Can you just give an overview of the history of the realism versus liberalism debate as worldviews?
Well, I think for many centuries now, the big divide within the world of international relations theory is between realism and liberalism. These are time-honored bodies of theory. And before I tell you what I think the differences are between those two bodies of theory, it is important to emphasize that there are differences among realists and differences among liberals. So when you talk about me as an offensive realist, you should understand that there are also defensive realists out there, and there are a panoply of liberal theories as well. But basically, realists believe that power matters, that states compete for power, and that war is an instrument of statecraft. And liberals, on the other hand, have what I would say is a more idealistic view of the world. This is not to say that they're naive or foolish, but they believe there are aspects of international politics that lead to a less competitive and more peaceful world than most realists see. And I'll lay out for you very quickly what are the three major liberal theories today that I think will give you a sense of the more optimistic perspective that is inherent in the liberal enterprise. The first and most important of the liberal theories is democratic peace theory. And this is a theory that says democracies do not fight against other democracies. So the more the world is populated with democracies, the less likely it is that we will have wars. And this basic argument is inherent in Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. He argues that democracy triumphed first over fascism in the 20th century. It then triumphed over communism. And that means that in the future, we're going to have more and more liberal democracies on the planet. And if you have more and more liberal democracies and those democracies don't fight each other, then you have a more peaceful world. That was his argument. It's a very liberal argument. A realist like me would say that it doesn't matter whether a state is a democracy or not. All states behave the same way because the structure of the system, getting back to our earlier discussion about international anarchy, the structure of the system leaves those states no choice, whether they're democracies or autocracies. And again, the liberal view, this first liberal theory, is that democracies don't fight other democracies, and therefore the more democracies you have, the more peaceful the world.
Can I just sort of try to unpack that a little bit? So on the democratic peace theory, I guess would say that in democracies, leaders are elected, and the underlying assumption is most people want peace, and so they will elect peacemakers. So the more democracies you have, the more likely you have peace. And then the realist perspective, what says that it doesn't matter if the majority of people want peace. The structure of international politics is such that superpowers want to become more super and powerful, and they do that through war.
You can't make that argument that you're making about democracies, because if you're saying that democracies are inclined toward peace and that the electorate picks leaders who are inclined towards peace, then you have to show that democracies are in general more peaceful than non-democracies. And you can't support that argument. You can find lots of evidence to support the argument that democracies don't fight other democracies. So the argument I believe that you have to make if you're going to support democratic peace theory, the main argument you have to make is that liberal democracies have a healthy respect for each other. and they can assess each other's intentions. If you're a liberal democracy and I'm a liberal democracy, we know we have value systems that argue against aggression and argue for peaceful resolution of crises. And therefore, given these norms, we can trust each other. We can know each other's intentions. Remember, for realists like me, uncertainty about intentions really helps drive the train.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking about two democracies, right, the argument there is that they know each other's intentions.
And for you, sure, maybe democracies reduce uncertainty a little bit, but not enough to stop the train.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's right. So that's democratic peace theory.
Yes.
The second theory is economic interdependence theory. And that's the argument that in a globalized world like the one that we live in and have lived in for a long time, there's a great deal of economic interdependence. And if you and I are two countries, or if you and me are two countries and we're economically interdependent and we're both getting prosperous as a result of this economic intercourse, the last thing that we're going to do is start a war, either one of us, because who would kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? It's that kind of argument. So there you have an argument that economic interdependence leads to peace. And then the third liberal argument has to do with institutions, sometimes referred to as liberal institutionalism. And this is the argument that if you can get states into institutions where they become rule-abiding actors, they will obey the rules that dictate that war is not acceptable. So if you get them to accept the UN rules on when you can and cannot initiate a war, then you'll have a more peaceful world. So those are the liberal theories. And as you can tell, they're very different from realism as articulated by somebody like me.
Can you maybe argue against the economic interdependence and in the institutions that institutions follow rules a little bit? So the golden goose with the golden egg, you're saying that nations are happy to kill the goose because, again, they want power.
If they think it's necessary to kill the golden goose,
Yeah.
because of security concerns, they will do it. The point is that economic interdependence at its root has prosperity as the core variable.
Yeah.
In the realist story, the core variable is survival. And survival always trumps prosperity. So if you go back to the period before World War I, we're in Europe. It's 1913 or early 1914. What you see is that you have an intense security competition between all of the great powers. On one side, you have the Triple Alliance, and on the other side, you have the Triple Entente. You have these two alliances, and you have an intense security competition between them, okay? At the same time, you have a great deal of economic interdependence. It's amazing how much economic intercourse is taking place in Europe among all the actors, right? And people are getting prosperous, or countries are getting prosperous as a result. But nevertheless, in the famous July crisis of 1914, this economic prosperity is unable to prevent World War I because security concerns or survival is more important. So there are, going to be lots of situations where prosperity and survival come into conflict. And in those cases, survival will win.
And maybe you can speak to the different camps of realists. You said offensive and defensive. Can you draw a distinction between those two?
Yeah. Let me just back up a bit on that one. And you were talking about will to power before. The first big divide between realists is structural realists and human nature realists.
Nice.
And Hans Morgenthau, who was influenced by Nietzsche and therefore had that will to power logic embedded in his thinking about how the world works, right? He was a human nature realist, okay? I'm a structural realist, and I believe it's not human nature. It's not individuals and some will to power that drives competition and war. What drives competition and war is the structure of the system. It's anarchy.
So you're not as romantic as the human nature realists.
Yeah, there's just a world of difference between the two.
Sure.
It's just important to understand that.
So within that, from the structural, there's a subdivision also of offensive and defensive.
Yes, inside the structural realist world, right? And you have a handful of realists who believe that the structure of the system fosters competition for sure, security competition, but it really rules out great power war almost all the time. So it makes sense to care about the balance of power, but to focus on maintaining how much power you have. That's the defensive realism, maintaining how much power you have, not trying to gain more power. Because the argument the defensive realists make is that if you try to gain more power, the system will punish you. The structure will punish you. I'm not a defensive realist. I'm an offensive realist. And my argument is that states look for opportunities to gain more power. And every time they see, or almost every time they see an opportunity to gain more power, and they think the likelihood of success is high and the cost will not be great, they'll jump at that opportunity.